It's great to see that Unknown Pleasures is back for 2024. And the first program for the year for Unknown Pleasures is on February the 13th. And it's about films made by Nick Ostrovskis. And it's my great pleasure to be speaking to Bill Mousoulis, of course, who's in charge of Unknown Pleasures, and the guest programmer for this series of films on the 13th of February. Dirk de Bruyn, welcome to Movie Metropolis.
Thank
Thank
you.
you,
Good
Peter.
to be here. Yeah,
Yep.
Good, good to talk to you both.
we're happy.
Yes, exactly.
Oh, it is. It's good. It's good to start the activities for the year. Like, even though I appreciated having a bit of a break over Christmas, New Year, I also wanted to get cracking again. Yeah.
You certainly have, and I've had a look now at all of Nick's films, and
Oh, good.
incredible experimental films. Tell me about the decision about selecting his films and focusing on him for
Yeah.
this Unknown Pleasures.
Well, I mean, in a way, he selected them himself because Jim Bridges and I set up this project where because I had a little bit of loose change lying around to transfer some Super 8, from the 80s to digitally, and contacting people, and some people were available and weren't, others weren't. And Nick was, we managed to track Nick down. That was a story in itself. And, I offered that it could transfer about an hour and a half worth of stuff. And he's the one that decided what that was, really. Because when you look at his program on his CV, I mean, we've got about a fifth. There's about a fifth of his
Mm,
stuff there. So it's
yeah.
kind of subliminally he made his own decision there. So, which is good. Yeah. I mean, I guess I made a decision about the order of things, the order that they played, because, one of the other interesting things about the work is that it's silent. A lot of it is silent.
Mm.
And it's his two 16 mil films, which he got funded for. He had more resources. So he ended up with some interesting music, the sound to go with that. Yeah. I think that
Well,
answers your question.
it does. The whole Super 8 scene in Australia in the 80s and 90s in
Yeah.
particular is so fascinating. And I mean, I've been speaking in the past to John Hughes and about so many other filmmakers at the time about especially the experimental films that were being made. And I think this program sheds a light on experimental films that were made in Australia, or certainly in Victoria and New South Wales at the time.
Yeah, I think it does. But I mean, an important part of that was the Super 8 group, which, Bill had a lot of influence on setting that up. And then one of the great things about that group, especially looking back, was this mixture. There was experimental, but it wasn't all experimental. Some of it and that sort of
Mm.
mixture created something that, looking back, that's very unique.
I,
Uh, you
I
know,
think it was, yeah, like, sorry, Dirk. Yeah, the
yeah, that's
Super 8
fine.
group was really like open to, whoever wanted to come along and show their work. And initially it was, when it first began, there were more like, narrative filmmakers and just kind of toying with, with narrative and imitating favorite films and that kind of thing. And yeah, Nick Ostrovskis is really interesting because the kind of, experimental work he did with the animation techniques, yeah, he stuck almost exclusively to Super 8, whereas people like yourself, Dirk, with that kind of
Mm,
work, or Paul Winkler, or all these other people were working on 16 mil. And
mm,
the irony, of course, was that by the mid 90s, when the Super 8 group was fully established and 16 mil was getting a bit more expensive, even the Cantrells joined the Super 8 group and started making
mm.
works on Super 8. So it was a really kind of open environment for a lot of filmmakers. Yeah.
And people would move in and out. They'd sort of move into Super 8 and then
Mhm.
out, and then go and do other things, and then come back again at some point. I mean, one of the other things that we've done, which is sort of related to this, is get the newsletters up online, and you can
Yes.
flicking through those, you can kind of see these kind of periods of shift But I think it's great that we're doing this with Nick, because he was, in terms of, he was very important to the Super 8 group. I mean, the Super 8 group and Nick were kind of, rusted together, really, weren't they, Bill? I mean, I remember, you're not you don't consider yourself an experimental filmmaker, but you were great friends with Nick too, during that time too, weren't
Yeah,
you?
yeah, absolutely. I mean, I do love experimental film too, but it
Yeah,
is
you
true
do.
that it's more narrative cinema that I'm into, that I myself do, for example. But yeah, yeah, I mean, I'm almost kind of feeling it again now with Unknown Pleasures, and also meeting some younger filmmakers in
Mm.
Melbourne and Adelaide. And oh, I just love filmmakers. I think I love, like, the artist as a filmmaker. And sometimes, yeah, you become friends with them. And like,
Mm.
you helped me out as well, Dirk, with my
Well,
16 mil projects. And so it really was like in the 80s and 90s, a real kind of community of people,
that's right.
especially when slightly bigger projects were done. And it wasn't just the one filmmaker doing, his or her own thing, that they could do, and without, working with others. There were collaborations. There were, even someone like Stephen Ball, even he worked on one of my films, on the soundtrack. And I mean,
Mm.
there's all these kind of connections that you wouldn't expect,
Mm.
basically. Mm.
I mean, that's another important political point I'd like to make too, is that a lot of this stuff has become invisible, and there's a lot of other areas of not experimental, but different things that happen in Melbourne that have been documented well, but this area hasn't, and there's political reasons for that, which can be overcome. But it is, when Bill said, it's talking to showing younger filmmakers. I mean, that's the one of the reasons I'm really interested in this, is because there are these generational shifts and stuff, and a lot of the areas when people learn about film, they kind of learn about stuff from other countries, and there's stuff happening in Melbourne here that haven't completely better worked out yet, but that's unique. I mean, when I've shown films, which I don't do that very much, but when I've shown some programs of Melbourne experimental stuff overseas, people are really curious about it. They find it different to what's happened in other parts of the world. And, I think we've got to do something about that. I'm interested in doing something about it. And I see this thing about Nick's work is like that. Because, I went to show some films in Serbia, and then they showed some film by this filmmaker who was doing all this time lapse stuff, and it was like he was the Serbian Nick. It's
Yeah, yeah,
like
yeah, yeah.
there's these characters all around the world that are like this, but I think our characters need to also be a part of that mix, part of that
Uh,
international dialogue.
yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, a lot of cities in the world have this kind of local, independent underground culture that doesn't
Mm,
travel, a lot, but it's very high quality. And
mm.
of course, yeah, people like you and me, Dirk, we're so attached to Melbourne. And of course, yeah, as you were saying at the beginning, just now, the Super 8 group and Super 8 films of Melbourne in the 80s, 90s have not been documented much so far. We've had, a bit on the Melbourne Filmmakers Co-op, and then there were, I don't know, like those other groups like Mima, which became Experimenter, and there were
Yeah.
other groups like that have had documentation, but the Super 8
Yeah,
group is
yeah, well, to
ready now.
clarify that though, Bill, I mean, you have done a lot of work in actually documenting the work that was done. I think one of the big issues is making sure that this is part of is to make sure that people actually can get a chance to see the work.
To see the films now and
Yeah,
restored versions. And
Mm.
because Peter, yeah, Dirk is this is part of like an overall project called the Shoring Project,
yeah,
and Shoring. Can
sort of
you
a bit of a pun.
explain that title? Yeah,
Yeah, it's a
Shoring.
bit of a pun, shoring up the past or shoring up something that seems to have fallen
Mm.
apart. But there's also the whole on the beach thing about the beach and the sand and the shoring of the shore and what's come
Mm.
here from other
Yep.
places. Because,
Yeah.
one of the other reflections about all this that I kind of find it interesting in terms of all these migrant pulses that have come to Australia. And they were evident in the Super 8 group for us. It wasn't all about that, but all those things are there and those narratives can be embedded through those films. And Nick is an example of that. Mate, his background, his parents are Latvian, and they came to Australia. They lived in the western suburbs, not too far from where I lived in North Altona, and not too far from what was his name? I think it was Ted Whitten's house.
Nettlecopoulos.
No, yeah, he
Nicholas
lives in Nettlecopoulos.
Nettlecopoulos.
I was thinking more of Ted Whitten.
Ted Whitten.
Whitten used to live around the corner from where Nick grew up in the
Okay.
circle,
Yeah.
you know, which has got
Yeah.
nothing to do with the film.
Okay.
So, there are more. There's more filmmakers coming, Peter, in this series. There's more
Yeah.
Great.
films that Dirk has restored, and we hope to have, maybe another program coming up in the next months at some point.
Mm.
But yeah, so it's quite exciting to rediscover these Super 8 short films.
It
Mm.
is, and the visibility is so important that these films are not lost, as you've already commented and are shown. And I can see a number of documentaries perhaps being put together about
Huh.
the 80s and 90s, about Super 8, about just like John Hughes's film and so on. So it'd be great to see much more of this. What intrigues me is in the 80s in particular with Nick's films, how
Mm.
were they shown? Were they shown in any way to larger audiences, or was it kept within the small community of the Super 8 group?
Well, it had a big range. I mean, those 16 mil films that Nick got funding for, they were shown in kind of national showcases and probably overseas. Uh,
Yeah,
one
overseas
thing I can
too.
say, yeah, one thing I can say about one of the films, I think it's the first film that we got Backyard.
Hmm.
I mean, that was dependent on being shown on Super 8 because he'd slow it, put it on, I don't know the projector, but a slow-mo projector where he would do 2 frames a second or something like that, in the original
Yeah,
screening
yeah.
of it. I mean, this version here, of course, we're not going to slow it down. It's already been digitally done. But I mean, that's an example of how the technology sort of allowed certain things to happen, And Nick would play around with that stuff and work out a whole lot of gestural things that became part of his kind of language, in the other films. And a part of all that too was the open screenings because Nick being so prominent, and we all did that. We'd all bring a couple of things that we hadn't quite finished. You bring it to the open screenings and get people's reactions to it. Sometimes good, sometimes bad. But the good and the bad. The bad was probably the most productive because that was the challenge. And there was that level of open screenings to it, and then there was another level of where there was sort of yearly showcases and things like that, and Nick made his way through that over time, as did a lot of people who worked through as well as Super 8 at the time.
Yeah, it's like the open screenings was in a room that, held 50 people, but then, we would use the RMIT cinema or the State Film Theatre, which became Cinemedia, which all that kind of thing. So we'd use these 150 to 200 seat cinemas to put the Super 8 festivals on. And then also Nigel Buist in the St Kilda Film Festival at the Palais was screening Super 8 films. MIF had Super 8 programs in, and again, I think using the State Film Theatre type venue, and that was in the 80s. And so, Super 8, especially in the late 80s, early 90s, was quite prominent and quite visible. And it's a pity, yeah, because it was on Super 8, a lot of those films were screened at the time and not seen again. So yeah, with Dirk's help, we're resurrecting them and we're screening them as much as we can. And yeah.
Okay.
I mean, it's interesting. Sorry, leave it. Yeah.
No, Dirk, go on.
Well, I was just because you mentioned Cinemedia, I mean, there are other characters too, like some people like John Smithies, who ended up looking after Mima, and he ended
Ah,
up being the director at
yeah.
Cinemedia. But he also had a thing happening at RMIT when he first started off, where kind of Nick was introduced to Super 8 through that.
I'll tell you what, that was the very first moment I picked up. Actually, not the very first moment, but like I've had no, training, no film school kind of training, but I did do like, I think it was 1 week at RMIT that, John Smithies had organized.
Yeah,
And I think Nick was probably even there himself. And it
I
was
think
just
he was.
a few casual sessions that we did. And I think Chris Knowles was helping
Yes.
out with them. And yeah, so John was really good at RMIT, and we had the RMIT Super 8 Club, and after a couple of years, I was called into like one of the offices at RMIT, and I was asked, "Are you an RMIT student? Are the other filmmakers here RMIT students?" And I said, "Well, no, most of us aren't." And we were using their facilities, their cinema. So
Mm.
that's when the Melbourne Super 8 Film Group was formed at the end of
Okay.
85 and it began in the start of 86. So there were a couple of years of the RMIT Super 8 Club as well.
Mm.
But that's how things morph in life. Yeah.
How
And these
interesting.
characters,
Yeah,
yeah,
go on.
and we're kind of all weaving out of these possibilities, and we're still doing it. We're still
Yeah.
kind of working away in a sort of grassroots kind of way, in an independent kind of way that, uh, doesn't really interest the funding bodies. So, but it
Yeah.
happens
Mm.
anyway.
Yeah.
Okay.
Go on, Peter. You can ask a question.
Yeah, ask a question.
No, I'm glad to hear both of you talk,
We're
and
just bouncing off each other.
which is great. I always appreciate that. What intrigued me, of course, the history of experimental film is just so incredible in many respects. I mean, if we go all the way back to Méliès and to Paul Winkler, you've mentioned, and Maya Deren and Man Ray and so many other incredible filmmakers. What intrigued me about Nick's films is the sort of hyperkinetic sort of style, the time lapse, the editing process, and I was intrigued to know more about the technical side of how he was able to put those films together, because they're really quite revolutionary, I thought, for Australian filmmakers. Perhaps you can describe more about that.
Well, I think, other people have done stuff like that, but Nick did it in Super 8, you know, and
Mm-hmm.
and I think that early film Backyard is kind of a good example of that, where he's kind of just moving the camera around doing stuff, and then he would slow it down and he'd work out how that worked, and then he'd sort of just learn how to kind of do that sort of gestural kind of stuff. And it's
Mm.
like, it's a bit like the way I would like people to use their iPhones these days, instead of being creative with it, getting the camera out and its mobility, move it around and get blurs happening, and I'll have a blur here and a blur there. This kind of attitude, I think that really comes through with Nick. And there's a very, even though they're silent, they're very melodic. And I think Maeve Wood sort of made a comment like that in one of the quotes, to saying that even though there's some of these films are silent, which is kind of a bit of a challenge, to what people are normally used to, but there are rhythms inside it that kind of just are about movement and stuff like that, that really are quite complex and quite mature. Yeah.
Mm. And
Mm.
also, Peter, with a lot of the animation ones, like where the camera zooms in even, and there's lots of like, flashing kind of
Mm.
images. A lot's just in camera. Nick just sets each little shot up, and he doesn't know really what it's going to look like in the end, what a 10-second sequence will look like.
Mm.
But obviously, after doing it a while, he's got his technique down pat, and yeah.
I
Okay.
mean, we should really ask Nick about those technical things. Well, I think we'll get a chance to ask him some of those questions after the screening, won't we?
Yeah, he'll come to the Q&A, hopefully. We're very confident he'll come along. So yeah, excellent.
Is he still actively making films?
No, my
No.
mate's life moved on. I mean, he's got an old mother that he has to kind of look after, which takes quite a bit of his time,
Mm,
and so he's kind of moved out of that. But he moved out of that before. before he started doing that.
Mhm.
Yeah,
I mean,
he actually about 20 years ago when he stopped making films, he actually concentrated quite a bit on art. Like he
mm,
was drawing and doing paintings and so there was a little period there where he was doing that. So he was keeping artistically busy. Mm.
Mm.
plays the banjo now.
Oh yeah, ukulele. Yeah,
Ukulele, that's right,
he's
not a
in a
banjo.
few ukulele clubs. Yeah. He's a
Ah,
character.
he should bring that to the Unknown Pleasure screening and
Ah,
accompany
we'll
his
suggest it
films.
to him, Dirk.
Yes.
Yeah, we'll suggest
Well,
it.
yeah, he could do a live soundtrack.
Yep.
Oh, he could too.
Yeah.
What a good idea. It's interesting to look at a film like Brain Surge, which I think was one of his funded
Mm.
films, and how incredible that is in terms of the use of color and movement and style, which is really very stylish. And again, it's so great that this film and others will be seen on February 13th.
Mm.
Absolutely. It's a like Brain Surge has got the music by Chris Knowles, and you look at it and you're mesmerized, you're blown away.
Hmm.
Mm.
So it's really and of the films that Dirk has compiled, I've just seen little snatches here and there. I'm leaving it for the cinema to have the
Mm.
proper experience of rediscovering all these films, which I saw back in the time. And yeah, it should be a lot of fun. Yeah.
Yeah, and there will be a difference. I mean, there will be a change, and it won't be exactly the way it was in the good old days because the aesthetics of these things changes. But we're living in a world where there's all sorts of ways of looking at films and all sorts of ways of
Hmm.
keeping it going. And I think Super 8 stuff uh, also needs to be part of that.
Yes.
Mm.
I was
Mm.
also intrigued by his film City by a River, which I
Yeah,
thought
that's
was a
right.
more conventional film, although there were some moments in there which are a bit more experimental. And I was intrigued that perhaps he was starting to contemplate also making narrative films. I don't know.
Oh, yeah, it's a good question. I mean, it is the one that's the easiest to talk about and the sequencing of it. And it's like a day in the life of the city.
Mm.
And part of that too was the fact that he was working in this building doing this I can't remember what the job was, but it's like it was so it had a different frame. It was like daily life. Like
Hmm.
he'd be up there with his cameras for I don't know how long, for how many months
Mm.
or a year or whatever. So it had a different it had that possibility to it. I think that's what you picked up there, Peter, that kind of durational thing
Mm.
about being in the same
Mm.
place all the time.
Yeah.
Yep.
How did he become interested in filmmaking in the first place? Do you know? Because it's so intriguing about how someone gets into the industry in the first place.
Good
Well,
question.
I'm just going to have a look at his profile on the Melbourne Independent Filmmakers site, which is my site. And let's see, he began
You
making
can't
films
remember
after.
everything verbatim you put on there,
No,
Bill.
I can't. So it said, yeah, it said Dirk that he attended the film workshop at RMIT in 1982, but it didn't say what drove him to,
Hmm.
make films. So it's
But I
always
think
interesting.
that's right. But I mean, the reason he kept doing it, I think, was because of the Super 8 group, because there was a place for this stuff to go.
Yeah,
You could get
yeah.
something back from it.
He
That
was
was,
big. He was a big part of the group. Yeah. Mm.
And that also leads to the other question, because there probably are, as you've already alluded to, so many other filmmakers who were making films at the time, Super 8, 16 mil, not necessarily experimental, but a whole range of other things, narratives and so on, which have never been seen or need to be unearthed and need to be screened or put into a documentary or DVDs or whatever so that audiences can see them.
well, we're already, this stuff is already fading because, with Jim, he was kind of very good in talking to people. I mean, it's very hard to find some of these people. And it's also, they have trouble finding their films,
Mm.
you know.
Yes, yes.
I've been
I've
talking to,
done Google searches on a number of filmmakers
yeah,
from the 80s, no trace. Even someone like Daniel Katsanis from the early 90s, he made like expanded cinema type works, and yeah, no trace of him on the internet. So it's a bit sad, but
Mm.
that's
there's a
life.
certain level
Mm.
of what Louise Curran calls disheartenment. Like there was a period where there was this community thing, and there was a lot of kind of ideas bouncing between people who were having interesting arguments. But at a certain point, different parts of people's lives fell away, and this stuff, and I find that very sad. And I think that's happened in Melbourne here in a way that it needn't have happened like that if some of the institutions had been more on the ball in terms of focusing on, retaining some of this work. I mean, they do that, but this is an area on the grey area where it hasn't happened.
Because it's considered too small a medium, too cheap, too amateur, which is really unfortunate. Yeah.
Well,
And yet,
yeah.
no, I was just going to say, and yet the social history of films like this are just so important in the development of cinema, and to neglect them it just seems ridiculous to me.
Good on you,
Well,
Peter. It's
yeah,
good.
good on you.
Yeah,
That's right.
good thought. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah.
So let's hear more about the event on February the 13th. What's going to be happening?
Well, I guess I'll talk here a bit. It's
Yeah.
our first event of the year, and Tuesday, Feb 13, and uh, yeah, we'll screen Nick's films. We'll have a Q&A, and I just wanted to mention some other things coming up after that. We're opening up the program a bit to guest programmers. So Digby Horton, I don't know if you know Digby, Peter,
No.
a young guy. He's going to program a couple of sessions for the year, and the first one is Richard Lowenstein program, which is like 2 half-hour films based around the work of his mother, Wendy. So that'll be in March, and then in April we've got John Flaus turning 90, so we're going to put on Peter Tammer's film, Flaus Film, which is a really great film. It'll
Yep.
complement what the Cinematheque's going to be doing the week before.
Was that at the same time? That's good.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, we decided. I mean, Adrian Danks and the Cinematheque had the same idea that we had, which was just to celebrate Flaus's 90th birthday by putting on a couple of his films. And yeah, they want to screen Yakety Yak and Forgotten Queensland
Queensland, yeah.
and Blood Money. I mean, Unknown Pleasures actually screened Yakety Yak and
Yeah.
Queensland last few years, but that's okay. They're great films. Unfortunately, John's actually in an aged care home now, so he's really fading away with his Alzheimer's. So we're not expecting him to be at any screenings, but yeah, he is turning 90 in April. So, and I just wanted to mention also that Unknown Pleasures, I hate doing this kind of stuff, but Unknown Pleasures, we always work at a bit of a loss. So we're setting up a slight loss, not too much. We try to break even each time. But we're setting up, Chris Luscri and I, for Unknown Pleasures, setting up a donation drive, and that'll be live in about a week's time. And we're just going to try and raise a little bit of money through that, so we can pay people like Dirk a little bit, and the filmmakers and interstate filmmakers. They travel on planes, and then we say to them, "Oh, we can only give you $100 or maybe nothing," and it's a bit kind of sad. But anyway, so we'll be having a bit of a donation drive, and yeah, we're really keen to have a great year and to keep going with this kind of programming, retrospective and some new films. And I'm glad someone like Dirk's around. I mean, Dirk and I worked together in the mid-80s on
Yeah, that's
programs.
right.
And,
That's right. We've had a bit of a history, haven't we, Bill?
yeah. And for him to be able to contribute to our programming now with the Super 8 restorations is fantastic. So, yeah, we're looking forward to a great year. So,
It is. Just mention February 13th. Please mention the venue and the website for more details and so on.
Yeah, so it's on at the Thornbury Picture House, and actually, I still haven't got the exact time of the venue, but it'll be about 8:20 or so. That second session they put on, and people can look up info about Unknown Pleasures on the web. they just type in Unknown Pleasures, independent film, and the website of Unknown Pleasures will come up. And there's, lots of details there about our past screenings as well. It's, we definitely keep all the notes and documentation from past screenings, videos of Q&As and everything. A lot of this is historically important. So,
Mm.
so that's basically it. Thornbury Picture House, Feb 13. Yeah.
Excellent stuff. I will ask you very quickly, both of you, have you seen anything of late that has impressed you?
Oh, I forgot that you asked this question. Oh, other times I'm sort of half prepared. Oh my
Oh,
God.
well, I did go. I
Uh,
did go and see Barbie at the Thornbury Picture House, quite a while ago now,
Good
and I
on you,
was
Dirk.
surprisingly,
Yeah.
yeah, I was probably the oldest person there, you know, but but I was surprised. I mean, some of the acting in that was fantastic. What was the
Yeah.
name of the male actor in that? Again,
Ryan
what's his
Gosling.
name? Yeah, he
Yeah.
was absolutely fantastic.
Oh, he's
Yeah.
I
pretty
mean,
good, Dirk. He's
that's
pretty good.
he's pretty good. Yeah. Anyway, that was
Like
it.
other
That's
things. Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. I saw the Lanthimos film recently, Poor Things. I saw The Old Oak by Ken Loach about 2 months ago, I think.
Mm.
So yeah, Poor Things I didn't mind, but it's just kind of a bit empty or something. You can have, surreality in cinema, but if it doesn't, also give you a different payoff, like something deeper, and instead you just get these flashes of, sex
Mm.
and bizarreness. It's, you sort of wonder, well, what's the point? But that's how his whole career has been in a way. But he's pretty interesting to look at. Yeah.
An
Yeah.
update of Bride of Frankenstein, I thought, but yeah, okay,
Yeah.
very
Yeah.
interesting to hear those comments. Okay, February 13th, Unknown Pleasures, films by Nick Ostrovskis, and Dirk de Bruyn is the guest programmer for Unknown Pleasures, and Bill Mousoulis, of course, who runs Unknown Pleasures with Chris Luscre. Thank you so much for talking with me.
Thank
Thank you,
you.
Peter. Thank you, Peter. Always appreciated.
Yeah, great on, good on you.
Pleasure. All the
Yeah.
best. Bye bye.
See
Adios.
you. See you.